Export restrictions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Updated August 25, 2020. Overview of export restrictions. In response to the coronavirus disease 2019 COVID-19 pandemic, countries all over the world, including the United States, have imposed temporary restrictions on exports of certain medical goods and some foodstuffs in order to mitigate potential shortages of key supplies. According to the World Trade Organization (WTO), for G20 countries, export bans accounted for more than 90% of trade restrictions related to the pandemic. Many measures are not explicit bans, but vary from licensing requirements to mandates for sales to the state. These restrictions have raised debate about the consistency of such actions with WTO rules and the potential impact on the global trading system. Some markets depend heavily on countries that have implemented restrictions. Most leading exporters are also major importers of critical supplies, with integrated supply chains at risk. The proliferation of such measures has prompted some countries to commit to limit restrictions or to abide by certain principles in their temporary application. Some members of Congress have weighed in on the issue, both in terms of the immediate disruption from COVID-19, but also on the future of supply chains. WTO rules. In general, WTO agreements are flexible in allowing the use of emergency trade restrictions related to national security or health that might otherwise contravene WTO obligations. The agreements require, however, that such restrictions be targeted, temporary, and transparent. Article 11 of the 1994 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) broadly prohibits export bans and restrictions, other than duties, taxes, or other charges. However, it allows members to apply restrictions temporarily, to prevent or relieve critical shortages of foodstuffs or other products essential to the exporting country. In the case of foodstuffs, the WTO Agreement on Agriculture requires members to give due consideration to the effects on food security of importing countries. In addition, general exceptions, for example, GATT Article 20 within WTO rules provide for policy flexibility, including to protect health, provided restrictions do not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination, or a disguised restriction on international trade, among other conditions. WTO leadership has emphasized the downside risks of curbs on exports and urged members to restrain their use and minimize disruptions to supply chains. The WTO has also called on members to abide by notification obligations and improve transparency on any trade-related measures taken in response to COVID-19. Recent U.S. actions. In recent decades, restrictions on U.S. exports typically have been applied to defense articles, dual-use goods and technologies, crude oil, or sanctioned entities. On April 7, 2020, the Federal Emergency Management Agency (FEMA), pursuant to the Defense Production Act (DPA), and other authorities, issued a temporary final rule banning the export of certain personal protective equipment (PPE), including certain respirators, certain surgical masks, and certain medical gloves, without explicit approval from FEMA. The rule included various exemptions, including exports of subject goods that are destined for either Canada or Mexico. The rule also required FEMA to consider the need to minimize disruption to supply chains, the humanitarian impact of a restriction, as well as other diplomatic considerations. The restriction applies to an estimated $1.1 billion of U.S. exports, Figure 1. On August 10, 2020, FEMA extended this temporary rule to December 31, 2020. Figure 1. U.S. imports and exports of goods now subject to FEMA's temporary export restrictions. Advocates of the policy argue that the measure is necessary to prevent evasion of U.S. domestic anti-hoarding actions by exporting goods to markets where they can command higher prices. Furthermore, advocates contend the measure was not an outright ban, but rather prioritized American demand and granted FEMA the discretion to allow the export of excess goods. Critics note that the United States imports many more of the goods subject to the restriction than it exports, thus imperiling U.S. supplies of those goods should more of its major trading partners take similar actions. Figure 1. Moreover, the United States is a net importer of other kinds of PPE, and critics worry that counter-export restrictions by U.S. trading partners might quickly encompass other goods. Still others are concerned about the impact of such restrictions on countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, many of which rely on U.S. exports of the restricted goods. As one trade economist noted, Jamaica gets more than half of its total imports of respirators, masks, and gloves from the United States. Export restrictions globally. By the end of July, nearly 90 countries had introduced export restrictions as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the WTO. Since January 2020, countries have taken more than 197 actions banning or limiting the export of certain products, according to Global Trade Alert. The products covered by these export curbs vary, but have broadly fallen into two categories: medical goods, medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, and equipment and foodstuffs. Getting an accurate picture of the total number of restrictions is difficult, as many WTO members, including China, have not yet officially notified the WTO's Secretariat of all measures. As of early August, 7 export restrictions and 37 quantitative restrictions had been notified. With respect to medical supplies, some analysts have argued that Chinese government actions in February, including prioritizing domestic use and making large state-backed purchases on the international market, fueled global PPE scarcity and prompted the global restrictions. Currently, China is selectively releasing PPE for export, with destinations seemingly chosen according to political calculations. See CRS Report R46304, COVID-19, China medical supply chains and broader trade issues. Figure 2. Export restrictions during COVID-19. Medical and sanitation supplies. Between January 1 and August 15, at least 67 countries took at least 152 actions imposing export restrictions on medical goods, a category that includes general medical supplies such as PPE, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, sanitation products, and other medical goods. While some countries have removed some restrictions, at least 88 remain in force. Foodstuffs. Between January 1 and August 15, at least 18 countries took at least 24 actions to restrict exports of foodstuffs, despite little evidence of shortages. While many of the more severe restrictions have been lifted, 8 remain in force. Economic impact. A growing economic literature has assessed the impact of past export curbs during crises, in particular related to raw materials and the food sector, on resource allocation, trade, and the competitiveness of industries. These studies have generally concluded that export restrictions, particularly by larger producers, can have ripple effects throughout the global economy, affecting both the level and volatility of supply and prices. In the short run, export curbs by larger exporters may result in lower domestic prices and increased domestic availability of scarce medical products. At the same time, such measures can reduce the total global supply and limit the availability of such goods for countries with limited manufacturing capacity. In addition, domestic price restrictions in exporting countries can reduce incentives for firms to produce and sell at home. Economists have also noted that export restrictions can lead to retaliatory measures that further cut off countries from essential supplies, disrupt supply chains, and create uncertainty. Taken collectively, export restrictions can be dangerously counterproductive. What makes sense in an isolated emergency can be severely damaging in a global crisis. Such measures disrupt supply chains, depress production, and misdirect scarce, critical products and workers away from where they are most needed. Other governments counter with their own restrictions. The result is to prolong and exacerbate the health and economic crisis, with the most serious effects likely on the poorer and more vulnerable countries. IMF and WTO, April 24, 2020. Reactions and global coordination. Countries and intergovernmental organizations have taken some coordinated action, as concerns mounted about growing export restrictions. In March 2020, for example, Germany, France, and the European Commission negotiated an end to intra-European export restrictions on medical supplies. That same month, G20 countries stated that any emergency measures taken must be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary, and must not create unnecessary barriers to trade or disruption to global supply chains. In April, the G20 agriculture ministers issued a broadly similar statement. In May, 42 WTO members pledged to lift emergency measures as soon as possible. The United States, EU, and China did not participate. Following expressions of concern, some countries, such as Turkey and Romania, have removed restrictions. In a June report on G20 countries, the WTO reported that by mid-May, 36% of COVID-19 trade restrictions had been repealed. At the same time, 70% of pandemic-related measures liberalized and facilitated trade. Some observers view the trade response to COVID-19 as reinforcing the need for a plurilateral agreement on medical goods to address broader trade issues, including the phasing out of export restrictions. Economists have favored this multilateral approach to helping diversify the supply chain and have advocated for a coordinated effort with close allies to prepare rapidly for a potential second wave of COVID-19 in the fall. Vaccines and trade. Economists and policymakers have expressed concern that if countries repeat the patterns observed in the spring, they might hinder the efficient production and equitable distribution of a future vaccine, as well as therapeutics. Countries, some observers worry, might place export controls on supplies and inputs necessary for the production of vaccines or on the vaccines themselves. Such actions would likely have a severe impact on the availability of any future vaccines in low-income countries in particular. Christopher A. Casey, analyst in international trade and finance. Kathleen D. Chimino Isaacs, analyst in international trade and finance.